Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back. I hope welcome back to another episode of the Wholistic Center, the podcast that talks about what does ancient wisdom have to teach a modern world. My name is Nicolas Zart, and I am your host on this podcast, at least for the foreseeable future. And it is my pleasure to kick off the second article on exactly what the website was built around, and that's to show us what did the ancient philosophies, civilization, wisdom leave for us today, especially today. This is 2026. And we're living in a very interesting world where a lot of geopolitical tensions, a lot of things vie for our attention. And also because here, especially in the West, we are taught to look outside, to look for eternal solutions outside of ourselves. Or as the X-Files said, the solution is out there. Well, we'd like to say, no, the solution is inside. It's always been inside. And it's kind of funny that once you finally find that stillness and that peace, you discover your best friend inside. And that was you all along, that thing which scared you so much. Anyway, so the second article, the first one was about Shintoism, and Shintoism is it's a particular philosophy, I guess. We can't really call it a religion, at least in the ways that we Westerners look at it. But over there, it is kind of seen as a religion. And I wrote a pretty good article. I think it's a pretty good article. I hope it's a good article. I'll let you guys judge from it, where I explain what Shintoism does and also what we can get from Shintoism. And Shintoism also most likely had some influence from the western part of Japan, meaning China. And in China, one thing that the ancient culture of China has left us today is something that is very near and dear to me, and that's Taoism. Now, I have to tell the story of how I came about in Taoism. I think I was about 14, maybe 15 in high school. And my counselor said, well, you need to take, the requisites, math, English, and whatever it was, history or geography. I can't remember. Then he said, and then after that, you can take, whatever you want. And I said, really, whatever I want? And I looked at all the different classes my school had. And one of them was called Eastern philosophies, and I thought, wow, well, this is pretty darn cool. And the very first thing that we started reading was the Tao Te Ching, or the Tao Te Ching, depending on how you look at it. And that was a complete revelation to me. It was the first time in my life where something actually made sense, because, especially if you've watched the first few podcasts that I made, Western society and Western education made no sense to me. It was bizarre. It was strange. It was alien. In fact, I thought, everybody around me were aliens. I mean, it was really bizarre for me growing up in the West. But when I read the Tao Te Ching, it clicked. It was the first time in my life I said, wow, that makes sense. And if you have not read it, hopefully you have read the Tao Te Ching. It's really a wonderful way of introducing you to Eastern philosophies. It's a beautiful principle, a beautiful philosophy that says that you cannot explain what life is, but you can certainly use our finite words to explain what it isn't. But most specifically, not just life, but the way of life, the essence behind life. So, anyway, you need to read the article. Maybe it'll make more sense too. And I got some pretty graphics in there too. But roughly, that was the beginning for me. And that introduced me later on to Buddhism, Zen, and so on and so forth. And then I moved on all the way out to the Western world, where I did find some ancient wisdom philosophies that were really good, but kind of got lost in it. So where does Taoism come from? It comes from China, most likely, or what we now call China. But it also came at a very turbulent time of the history of China. A lot of wars, a lot of tribes fighting with one another, roughly around 475 to 221 before our era. And so there were a lot of philosophers. And this is really interesting. If you think about today, we're in January 2026. There are a lot of crazy things happening all over the world, things that we have not seen, at least not in my lifetime. Perhaps we saw that a long, long time ago, but there are a lot of crazy things happening right now. There's a lot of geopolitical tensions everywhere around the world, and you can definitely get a sense of big powers are shifting the way they move and do things. It's also a time where you have a deep research with a lot of people on spiritual stuff, esoteric stuff, or personal growth. I guess that's a much better way of saying it. So the foundational text when it comes to Taoism is really the Tao Te Ching or the Tao Te King, depending on how you pronounce it. And it's attributed to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu in China means simply old master, old wise person, right? So it's not the person's real name. And in fact, scholars can even agree on whether or not anyone by the name of Lao Tzu existed. Now, there were lots of Lao Tzus, lots of venerable ones, distinguished ones, right? That happened a lot. Yes, by the way, no, we're not going to talk about Confucianism. We'll talk about it a little bit later because it's a little bit different, although it serves a really interesting purpose too. But it reveals a fundamental way of looking at reality, and especially for us Westerners. Again, we're brought up to look out the external. We're brought up to learn how to use our hands to grasp things, to not defecate or urinate in our pants. Everything is really pretty much outward focus. Think about it. When were you taught in school to meditate? When were you taught in school to think quietly, have stillness around you? No, you're taught how to think. You're taught how to follow things, but this is all for external purposes, to get a better job, to get a wife, to get a husband, to get a bigger car, etc., so on and so forth. Taoism goes about things a very different way. First of all, what does Tao means? And Tao in China can be translated in various ways. The best ways that people have thought to translate it into is the way. Now, this is a beautiful thing that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? But it means the way of life. And in fact, a lot of Chinese ideograms show Tao as a gateway to go through, or what you should be following. A lot of martial arts also use Tao, and that's really interesting. So I think the opening line says it all. And I'm reading from my notes because I don't really commit things to memory, which I'll explain why some other day. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Now that already says it all. Why? Well, because it's very simple. Our language is very finite, right? And we're taught again from a very early age to sort of look at life in a yes or no kind of way, day and night, positive, negative, is this good, is this bad, right? And we're not really told subtleties or the finer shady grays, right? And so language also, and if you have studied various different languages, you'll notice that some languages are better at certain things than others. In other words, German is supposed to be absolutely phenomenal when it comes to philosophy, and that's because it had a lot of philosophers and because they know how to put words together to create bigger words and get really down to it. Russian is supposed to be absolutely beautiful for poetry because you can really change the structure of the sentence and do whatever you want. French is very hierarchical. You build your rationalization and you explain like that. But English is the opposite. English is kind of like you open up a faucet and water flows out and it takes whatever flow it needs to. This is also a good time to tell you that in college, I was studying languages, I was studying literature, and a friend of mine, a Chinese friend of mine, we were talking, and he said, I feel so sorry for you Westerners. And I said, why? He goes, because when you read, you have so much mental process that you have to go through in order to understand what you're reading. I said, explain it. He goes, well, think about it, right? Take a whole sentence. You don't just read a whole sentence. You look at the very first letter of the very first word and you sound it out. Then you read the others and you sound them out. And then together you sound out the word. And then you do the same thing for the next one. Then you put the whole sentence together to make sense of it. He goes, me, on the other hand, when I read Chinese, I see situations. It's easier. And I thought, wow, that's the zenith of communication if I've ever seen that. And hence, by the way, this also links right back to an article I wrote about thoughtless thoughts, or thoughts without images, right? Because as soon as you start to use words, you're sort of constraining yourself to a buildup of logical streams of characters and a certain way of speaking where the subject is here, the verb is here, and then what you have to say is after, right? So communication has always been very important to me, hence why I actually, have done that most of my life. And the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. And that's because, well, if you really look at the infinite universe, there's really not much we can explain. I mean, think about how hard it is to explain what quantum sciences are. And yes, I say quantum sciences because it's really nothing much mechanics about quantum physics, right? It's anything but physics and mechanics. It's pretty much extraordinary. Simply put, the Tao is the way, and it helps you figure out how to flow through life instead of restrict it, order it, or try to force it. The Tao is not a god, by the way, and it's not God either, but it is the underlying source, the energy behind everything, the flow of life. So you have to kind of rationalize it this way. Like gravity or the changing season, the Tao simply is whether we acknowledge it or not. So this is also a pretty interesting one. Chapter 11 is really interesting, and that's the one, at least for me, that just made perfect sense, right? And it talks about a wheel. And if you think about a wheel and imagine a wheel with spokes, right? We tend to look at the tire around, the spokes and everything. But Taoism, especially Lao Tzu, says, the most important part of it is not the spokes or the wheel or the tire or anything like that. It's the hub. That central piece that's empty. That's what makes it useful. Similarly, a cup is not really interesting because of that part. It's interesting because of this empty part right here, because that means we can put liquid in it. That's the importance of a cup. Not the shape, not what it looks like. It's the emptiness within, which is absolutely brilliant, right? It's just something that everybody should keep in mind forever. And likewise, a house is not the most important things are not the walls or the floor or the roof, but the empty space in between. That's where we live. That's where we dwell. That really gives you a really good idea of what Taoism is. So, it's a way of saying that we tend to look outside for the tangible. We tend to look outside for the shapes. We tend to look outside for solutions when ultimately the emptiness inside is the most important part. And for those of you who are a little bit more down to earth, you know that, how atoms work and everything. And you know that we're basically 99% emptiness, such as the universe is. And so it's within that emptiness, that empty space, that things happen. Also, in between breaths, that's when the molecules in our body really start to connect with one another. They exchange, right? Not when you take your breath, not when you let go of your breath, but right after that, in between. It's fantastic. Now, Taoism also introduces a concept that has been pretty vulgarized in the West, especially in the 60s, and that's Wu Wei. And there's a great book, which I have to put in the article, called the Dancing Wu Li Masters, that also introduces that whole notion of non-action, especially when it comes to observing in everything that you do in your life. But Wu Wei, if you translate it, means non-action, non-doing. And it doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. That's just laziness or whatever. That's doing nothing. That's very different. Non-doing can be done with action. You can be an artist, and especially for those of you who play instruments, by the way, there is that point in when you play where all of a sudden you're just playing, but you're not forcing yourself to play. It's not an intellectual thing. You just flow with it. I used to run cross country, and at one point or another, I would get that runner's high, and all of a sudden I was running effortlessly. Same thing in martial arts, by the way. You might learn a lot of things, a lot of movements, a lot of this, a lot of that. And the more and more you practice, all of a sudden there's that Wu Wei moment where there's a non-doing, and it just happens without you thinking about it. It's extraordinary. So I talk about a lot of research done with all of this that sort of confirm why Taoism makes a lot of sense for us today. And Wu Wei, by the way, is described. I like the description of this research here that says that it's a state of perfect knowledge of the coexistence of the situation and the perceiver. Perfect efficaciousness and the realization of a perfect economy of energy. Let that one sink in, because it is beautiful. It's something, like I said, that you find in Kung Fu and Tai Chi Chuan and also in Aikido. You find a lot of these, especially the flowy parts of martial arts, as contrary to the ones that are more static, more blocking and things like that. There's blocking in kung fu. Don't get me going. I used to do a lot of kung fu, so I can talk about that forever. One thing that comes up very often in Taoism, especially in the texts, is water. And water is absolutely fascinating to the early Taoists because they see it as something that's fragile, right? It's soft. You can throw water at someone, you're not going to hurt them. I mean, obviously, you throw water in the eyes, it will be painful sometimes, but it doesn't really do anything. It's soft. It goes around obstacles. It doesn't bump right into it. Yet, one thing that water does over time is it will mold and shape even rocks. It will disintegrate metal. And so the idea of water is very important to keep in mind when you think about Taoism, when you go throughout your life and you think of Tao and you try to stay within the Tao, is to be like water. Water always finds the lowest spot to rest. Water always goes around every obstacle in the world. And eventually, water always goes in the direction that it really wants to, well, at least according to gravity. That's important. So nothing in the world is softer or weaker than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong. Isn't that beautiful? That says it all. Wu Wei is acting without struggle. It's achieving without forcing. It's accomplishing through alignment rather than through brute force. So this is really important. And think about it, especially in terms of what we see today. When we look at movies from Hollywood, there's a lot of explosion. There's always one big hero that changes the fate of the world. And same thing with TV shows and something in music right now. It's just really forceful. It's in your face. It's meant to distract you and everything. Taoism is totally the opposite. It says, take your time. Just look around. Look at nature. A tree, as strong as it is not a brute force. It cracks through concrete. It breathes. It grows every year. Despite its hard trunk, it grows another layer and another layer. It manages to come out with leaves in the middle of twigs. How does it do that? It's beautiful because it also uses a lot of water, obviously. Best writer that Taoism has to this day. Now, Zhuangzi actually did exist. There are plenty of recollections of him being a real person. In fact, he met Confucius and made fun of him too, which was really interesting. We'll get into that way later because I think that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. But one of the famous stories of Zhuangzi is that he was dreaming that he was a butterfly, and he was dreaming and just like a butterfly was going from flower to flower, having fun and everything until he woke up. And when he woke up, he scratched his head and he was like, wait, was I really a butterfly? Am I a butterfly? Or am I a butterfly? Or am I a human dreaming about a butterfly? Or am I a butterfly dreaming about being a human? Now, for those of you who love that quirky Chinese or ancient Chinese ways of telling stories that are very quirky, keep you on your feet, and always give you a cool little twist at the end, Zhuangzi's writings on Taoism is absolutely phenomenal. And go out there. You can get plenty of free distributions on the internet. If you can get yourself a good book, you'll love it. It's quirky as all heck. And they're clever little puzzles, almost the same thing as the Chinese koans of Zen Buddhism that ask, or the Japanese Zen koans that ask, what is the sound of a tree falling in a forest? I don't know. If I'm not there, I can't hear it. I can't tell you exactly what it is. I know that through memory and through what I've heard, I know that it should be a certain way, but I'm not there. Or what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? I mean, just those little kind of quirky things that really get you to go, whoa, unplug from your brain. The other great story is Kuok Ding, who talks about cutting through animal flesh, but yet after decades, his knife is still sharp. And so they asked him, they said, how do you do this? And he goes, I don't do it. I put my knife and it goes through where the openings are, where the empty spaces are, and everything comes apart. That's also another nice little way to do it. Another great story, and this is one of my favorites, is there was a really ugly tree out there. They kind of wanted to cut it, and they were like, no, it's too ugly and it's all warped and it's going to be hard to make something out of it and everything. And so the little tree eventually grows into a big tree. But it also gives shades to a lot of people, to animals. It gives sort of a haven for critters under and everything. And hence that's one of the morals of the story, because of course there are tons of morals that you can extricate out of these stories. Is even if you are a little like this, you might have a big nose, you might have a big zit right here or whatever, it doesn't matter, because all of this serves a purpose. Even if it's not very obvious at first, it will eventually become obvious later. In other words, Taoism champions the utility of the useless. There's no such thing as useless. So what does Taoism teach us for modern life? I'm talking about you at work, you in a relationship, you by yourself just thinking. Well, it tells you to sort of break away from, the hustle of your culture, that this is just an external thing. This is something that's imposed on you. This is something that really is meant to make something continue to be, but not necessarily for you to enjoy all the fullness of those riches. And again, those are external things, so they're great. But, when you die, you're not going to take that money with you. Taoism gives you a wonderful analogy to follow the rhythms, understand the rhythm. Don't try to control them and everything. Just be aware of them at first. Observe without judgment. Always important, right? But don't go against them, right? We all know that prolonged exposure to stress causes absolutely horrible things inside of a body. I mean, right down to not being able to reproduce. Stress causes mental illness. It causes also a lot of cancers. I think a lot of studies are finally showing this, something that we've always kind of known. But this Wu way of being, this Taoism way of being, really helps you more align with life. And it doesn't mean to be passive and not do anything. It just means to be quiet a little bit. Right, Nicholas? Be quiet a little bit, but observe, not judgmental, and then go with it. And by the way, this will help a lot in your ways of doing manifestation. I see a lot of people saying, manifest by wanting this, by going after your dreams, and it's very male-dominated, hard, brutal energy, when in fact it's quite the other way when you manifest. You push a few items in that direction, then you let the universe do what it knows how to do, orchestrate all of this thing without you butting in. Again, because our minds are very finite, our words are very finite. It's very hard to grasp everything that's going on out there. Another thing that I write about in the article is I was lucky to have gone to a very famous Taoist temple in Shanghai called the Baiyun Taoist Temple. It's the White Cloud Temple. And according to sources, there is a realized master in there. And unfortunately, I didn't get to see that master. But the one thing that I did notice was, in the hustle and bustle of what Shanghai is, that it was peace inside. It was absolute serenity inside. And despite all the people coming in and coming out and doing their things and doing offerings, which, by the way, I also did my offerings, there was a certain peace about it. And it was kind of funny. They looked at me like, what's this foreigner doing here? But that was it. That's all. There was just no lingering looks or anything like that. It also reminded me of something I had forgotten since I had lived in Japan, is how a lot of Asian cultures have no problem marrying the philosophical with the religious. In other words, how to make a philosophy an everyday affair through what we now call in the West religion, right? So it was really fantastic, and highly recommend if you go to Shanghai to visit the Baiyun Temple. It's being absolutely fantastic. Now, mostly what Taoism has taught me, I'm not going to say taught me because that would be too pretentious, but has told me to try to do more than anything, is to be a master of myself in today's society. In other words, when I was also 13, 14, I was, reading all these amazing books, and I was thinking, God, I got to go back to the Himalayas, go and meditate in the caves, and that would be so much easier. Then a little voice came to the back of my head and said, yeah, but you've done that before, so many times before. You've mastered that. Now you need to master being a master in the middle of society, in the middle of the hustle and bustle. So this is what Taoism teaches you, is that perfect alignment, that peaceful alignment to the ineffable Tao, the way of life that you need to strive. And then, to be kind on yourself, be like water. Be gentle. You'll find ways around obstacles, and it's not done through brute force, forceful thinking, harsh manifestations. That does not seem to work, at least not for me. And there was an interesting study, by the way, in China about Chinese leadership that showed people who embraced the Wu Wei principles and concepts had much better results in life and much better results in business. So imagine bringing this to the West. I could go on forever about that, but that would be something for our other podcast that talks about mobility instead. So what we walk away from with Taoism is that the emptiness is really the important thing. Between the walls, the ceilings, and the floor is where we live in. Well, that's all emptiness. The cup inside of it where we drink, the glass, that's the most important thing. The wheel is only as important as the hub that makes it work, right? And another great Hermetic philosophy here that says the swing to the left is accompanied to the swing to the right. But if you really know how to get to the fulcrum of it, you can still witness it, but not be swung back and forth, right? So it's always those things that we don't always think about: the middle road, the middle ground, the middle path, the pathless path. That's where everything happens. And it's important to keep that in mind. And by the way, this is something I've seen over and over and over with a lot of wise people from Africa that I met through my mother working at UNESCO, is a lot of them were so wise, so deep, and they had that inner stillness. They were in the middle all the time. It was fascinating. So practicing Taoism today, I'm just through a bunch of things, but the first thing you want to do is notice where you're forcing something, where you feel pushback, where you feel resistance, right? That's the first thing you want to do. Find the empty space. And that can mean anywhere from something physical to something in between words, in between sentences, in between being with someone. Practice patience. Boy, that one took me a long time to develop. And then move like water. Just move like water. Water finds its way. So will you. Don't cry and demand too many things. Things happen eventually. Question your categories. Now, this is something that was interesting because think of the people we have around us. Think of what leadership looks like around us, and you see how much force they exert out there. It's almost kind of makes you feel sad, right? You can't do it in a better way than to show force or cockiness or arrogance or attitude. It's almost like you're masking something. Align with natural rhythms. Now, this is something that I love to do in the winter. I love staying home doing nothing. Obviously not doing nothing, but practicing more Wu Wei than ever. I have my specialty that I drink in the winter, and I love the quietness of being with my two Labradors and walking them in the forest. Well, in the summer, I have more livelier teas, and I like to have a little bit more action. So, Taoism is 2,500-year-old philosophy that still lingers today, and it has something to teach us. And it's practiced in the East still to this day. Doesn't mean we can't do it in the West, obviously. Think about it, especially if you're getting burned out, especially if you're stressed out and everything, incorporating this into your life. And of course, we suggest that, hey, share it with us, share with us what works, what doesn't work for you. It's always good to hear what somebody else has to say. But the gift of Taoism today is it gives us a break from always looking for this external reward, always being so externally focused, and more internally focused where that emptiness, empty space is within. This is where the magic is. Anyway, we hope that you've enjoyed this article on Taoism and what it can bring us today. What wisdom does it have for us today? We would love for you to subscribe to this channel. Give us a like, because that really helps a lot. And of course, to write down your thoughts. What has worked for you? Do you know about Taoism? Have you heard about Taoism? Have you ever read the Tao Te Ching or any of the Chuang-Tzu's teachings and writings? They're spectacular. I highly encourage you to download a few of them and read them. And again, if you know anyone interested in this holistic way of life that we're introducing out there, we're not inventing it. It's something that makes perfect sense, that was practiced eons ago and still to this day. Please share with someone who might like it. In the meantime, my name is Nicolas Zart, and this is the Wholistic Center podcast. And we're very happy to have had you watch us today and listen to us. And we hope to see you again next week. Thank you very much.